Hello and welcome back to What They Left Behind. I'm your host, Katie, professional genealogist, and this episode is going to be a little bit different. I took advantage of the time I spent with my very good friend this weekend to have a conversation about story and narrative, the psychology of that, and what it looks like in context of genealogy, our ancestors' histories. It ended up being a really fun and interesting conversation. So I hope you enjoy it. So I'm here with my best friend. This is Chelsea Bartlett. Do you want to do a quick introduction? I mean, we've known each other since we were
Three.
I think I was 2.
Yeah,
So a long time.
a long time.
And today I thought we would dive in a little bit to sort of the psychology of stories and like the stories that we tell ourselves about our lives and our ancestors' lives and why stories are important and why we find them to be in like every aspect of our life. I mentioned briefly in the last episode that like we're the only species that has stories. Like it's not just thumbs that set us apart as humans. There's other animals that have thumbs that do not have the type of civilization that we do. Yeah, so Chelsea,
Yes.
you are a writer.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to tell us just a little bit about like your like education and like background as someone who clearly loves stories enough to make them?
Sure. Well, as you know, I've pretty much been writing for my entire life.
As long as I've known you.
Yeah. Basically, I think since I was like 4, I started like dictating stories to my mom to like write down for me because I needed to do it even before I could physically do it.
Right.
Um, and then, it was like always my favorite thing to do in school, and I would write stories, in between classes and during classes. Um, and, we grew up in a very fostering place in
Yes.
terms of our academic and creative development, I would say. And like teachers were always willing to give us extra time and space and attention if we really wanted to like engage with something. So I had a lot of encouragement in my story writing as a kid. And when I was going to college, I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And I was like a real stickler for it. I was like not going to apply to any schools where I couldn't get a creative writing degree. So I ended up getting a Bachelor of Fine Arts in creative writing. Took a year off to try to like figure out what I wanted to do after college and decided that I just wanted to keep doing that actually. So
That
then
thing you've been doing your entire life so far.
exactly. So then I went and I got a master's of fine arts in creative writing as well. So,
Awesome. 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 So I am someone who, I mean, clearly, if we've been best friends as long as we have, I also very much enjoy stories. I have never been as prolific of a writer as you have. Um, I think that would be difficult. But I mean, we've both always enjoyed stories, written stories together, critiqued the stories that we've taken in, whether that be movies or books or TV shows or the gossip in middle school.
right.
Um, I guess the first question I have to kind of start off this conversation is as far as like the academic definition goes, like what is a story?
Oh, well, I mean, this is going to tie neatly back into where you want to go, actually.
Wonderful.
Because a story, like, is technically, I don't know if this is what the definition would be, but as far as like academically from a creative writing standpoint, a story is basically the rise and fall of a conflict. It's sort of the setup, the tension building to some sort of like conflict, and then the climactic moment where that conflict is like faced head on, and the resolution following action once it has been resolved.
Right.
That structure is what a story is.
Okay. So it's conflict presented, conflict becomes inevitable, conflict is in some way resolved.
Right. And it can be resolved positively or negatively. And the character is basically like the being who has to go through that arc.
Okay. So I did a little bit of research over the last week or so. I will say, actually, quick tangent. We're recording this episode because I actually initially was planning on doing my Jean Lafitte episode next and started getting into it, and it was just too fascinating and there was too much. So that is what is coming next. Fun sneak peek. And Chelsea and I had already had a weekend planned to just chill,
Yeah.
and we just needed a break. So uh this is me working within my constraints and trying to
Stay consistent.
yes,
At the same time.
and this topic I think is very like adjacent to the work that we do in genealogy, because we are researching other people's stories. We are presenting to our clients their ancestors' stories. So like even though there is an immense amount of like research and like names, dates, academia, like it when it comes down to it, like what the meaning of all of that is and what is meaningful to the people receiving that information is the story that their brain like compiles from that information.
Right, because we sort of have like this natural inclination to search for patterns and to organize things that we learn into a narrative structure in order to derive meaning from them.
Right. So actually, that ties really nicely into the research that I've been doing this week, which is where did this habit come from? Like, how did humans develop this? Because clearly, it being a uniquely human trait, there had to be some kind of like developmental or evolutionary advantage to this inclination to find patterns and create narrative and make stories. So that actually brings us very nicely into the research. I'll give you a little bit of research. We can chat about it.
Yeah.
So to start off, I want to talk really quickly about something called mirror neurons. Scientists who have studied brain activity using electrodes have found that a certain set of neurons will fire when you, say, lift your arm and pick up a pencil. They have found, however, in the same area of the brain, about 20% of those same neurons will fire when you watch someone else lift their arm and pick up a pencil. And these neurons, these like 20% in that same area, scientists refer to as mirror neurons. Which is like so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
It reminds me actually a little bit of a conversation that we had during breakfast today, where your partner described ripping off a toenail in the pool,
Yes.
and we both fully cringed.
Yes.
Even though we didn't experience that.
Right.
But there was a mirror of discomfort, disgust, pain, like fully like
cringing.
Like and that is so scientists think that these mirror neurons not only give us empathy, but they're also the reason that story developed. So 75,000 to 100,000 years ago, archaeologists have pinpointed a widespread emergence of skills in our species that are unique to human beings. So tool use, using fire, making and finding shelter, developing language. And neuroscientists theorize that this is the basis of the development of culture and civilization. They think that this is when the mirror neurons started firing, and it became so advantageous to our species to have that happen, that it continued and became widespread. Another example of mirror neurons is the phenomenon that happens with touch. When you see someone else get poked in the arm, mirror neurons fire in the same area of the brain that would react if you got poked in the arm. But your own nervous system is able to recognize that you are not receiving that actual physical sensation of being poked, so you don't actually feel it. Your brain doesn't like process and give you the sensation of being poked. But if your arm is anesthetized and numbed and you experience the same visual input of someone else being poked, you will feel it.
Oh, that's so weird.
It's so trippy. And scientists have actually used this phenomenon to help people who have phantom limbs. So if you've had a limb amputated for any reason, and there are some people who will experience like phantom pain, or they will like, it feels to them like they can move it or not move it, and they can use that same phenomenon to like have someone else's like arm be massaged, and it will help relieve the phantom pain of the person who has an amputated limb,
Right.
which is so fascinating.
Yeah.
So hearing, reading, and watching stories has a similar effect, as does like the pretend play that we engage in as children,
Right.
which obviously we have a lot of memories of.
Yes.
And it's so interesting to see what type of pretend play children engage in, because it almost always is like actually kind of dark,
Yeah.
like kidnapping.
Yes, lots of kidnappings.
Lots of kidnappings, or the baby is sick,
or the baby died.
yes, and it's very dark,
Yeah.
honestly. And so even at a very young age, we are drawn to like that conflict in story, which we're going to come back to.
Yes.
But one of the other things that story does for us that is advantageous as far as like the development of humanity and culture and civilization is that it helps with memory.
That makes sense.
And I don't have exact reason. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't have exact reasons as to why this is true, but I do know from several academic articles and from my own experience that like I tend to remember things so much better when they're in story. Like I have more knowledge of the founding fathers and the American Revolution since listening to Hamilton than I have retained from my AP US history class.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And I didn't even get that into Hamilton.
I got very into Hamilton. So that's just a basic example. Taking a story and like bringing it to life with that sort of nonfiction basis helps us remember that type of information better. Another way that we do this is with mnemonics. So do you remember the mnemonic for planets?
I can't say I do.
Okay.
My memory is not that good.
No, you spend too much time in other stories. So the mnemonic that we learned in school for the planets is my very educated mother just served us 9 pies.
Okay.
Or 9 pizzas.
Yeah.
Now,
did they change it?
Yes, well, Pluto's not a planet anymore.
That's right. Poor Pluto.
So now it's my very educated mother just served us noodles.
Okay. I feel like that's harder to remember. Not that I remember the old one. I could have named all the planets though, just to be clear.
Well, that's so interesting, and that's just probably because of like repetition.
Yeah.
Another one.
Oh, and probably also because of Sailor Moon.
Okay, but story, right?
Yeah.
Another one is please excuse my dear Aunt Sally.
Yeah, that's PEMDAS. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but Do you remember what it stands for? Because I
No.
remember PEMDAS, and I
Yeah.
remember Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally.
It's either math or grammar. I'm pretty sure it's math.
It's math. Yes. It's
Parentheses.
parentheses, exponents,
I couldn't even remember.
multiplication, division, addition, subtraction.
Yeah.
But
I couldn't remember the word exponents. So
Chelsea is very language oriented.
like I said, I have a master's degree in creative writing.
Do you have any other mnemonics that you use?
I don't think I really personally use them, to be honest with
Fair,
you.
fair.
I did use PEMDAS though. I think
Yeah.
when I did do math, when I was forced to do math, like I would write it at the top of my
Yep.
test page just to remind myself of the order.
The only other mnemonic that I can think of off the top of my head, and I don't know if I remember it accurately, is the order of the dressage letters around the dressage arena.
That makes sense.
And I know it's something about a king. Editing Katie jumping in from the future here to say that the mnemonic I could not remember is all King Edward's horses handmade bay foals. And I could probably tell you what the letters are. So maybe that was a bad example. But that's another one that I remember there was a mnemonic for it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that those do help people because it triggers your memory. You don't have to remember the whole string of planet names in the right order as long as you remember the little phrase.
And if you forget what order the planets go in, even if you can name all the planets, you can use that to
put them in order.
Right.
Yeah.
So, actually a 2019 study at the Institute of Psychology and Ergonomics in Berlin found that using this kind of memory aid not only increased accuracy when performing a specific set of tasks, but also found those who used the mnemonic were able to more quickly resume their task at the correct step after an interruption.
Oh, interesting.
Than those who weren't given the memory aid.
That makes sense. Because then you've got kind of a bookmark. You can just be like, oh, let me flip to this page in my brain.
Right.
Got it. And then flip right back.
Right. So I just thought that was so fascinating. And knowing that these types of mnemonic devices usually do at least somewhat use our story brains to remember them. There's an image in your head of Aunt Sally.
Right. Or the planets eating pizza.
Right. Right. It does create sort of I know that there's different, there are some people who actually don't think in images at all.
Yeah.
Which is also fascinating, but that is one of the reasons that it works is that you are picturing an image. I don't know what Aunt Sally did, but please excuse her. So I think that that's probably one of the other reasons, though, that it really stuck around. It not only created empathy and made learning a lot easier. That was one of the other things that they said with the mirroring neurons is that you could just watch someone do something. So the example that they gave, and I keep saying they, I will have sources on my website, I promise. But the example that they gave is that it took the polar bear about 100,000 years to evolve in a way to have the coat that they do now that is waterproof and very warm and insulating. And a human hunter could go kill a polar bear, skin the polar bear, put the skin on, and someone watching them could learn that in the time it takes them to do it. Yeah. It doesn't take the 100,000 years
to naturally develop the right mutation.
Yes. Right. So that was one of the advantages of these mirror neurons is that those skills could be passed very quickly. One person could, accidentally make fire and other people could watch, and that skill very quickly spread because it was a very important skill to have.
Yeah, very useful.
Light, warmth, cooking,
someone just accidentally makes fire and everyone else is like, damn, that's good, I'm stealing that.
Exactly. So it's the idea of story, the mirror neurons, the memory advantage, like it's all really important to the way that we live and therefore survive.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the reasons, like one of the things I was really looking into. I was like, why do humans
Yeah.
like stories? Also, there was a study in 2016 by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where researchers reported that women rated good male storytellers as more attractive than poor storytellers as long-term partners,
Interesting.
and perceived them to have higher status and be more capable of leadership and be more admirable.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It's I just found that to be so
It is. It's
fascinating.
very interesting.
But they found, especially like in community, stories are beneficial for building community, unifying, skill sharing, cooperation. They create social harmony. They also shape beliefs and values, and they allow individuals to share values and resolve conflicts peacefully.
Yep.
So it really is not only language, but this development of story that has really shaped how humans came to live in the communities and societies and cultures in the way that we do. Like we
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have any of those things without these mirror neurons and without this like drive for story.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all of the scientific information that I have, but I thought we could talk a little bit about one of the things that kept coming up is like, so why do we crave story like in today's world? Clearly, like we've developed this need for it developmentally
Mm-hmm.
as far as like the advancement of our species, but why is it today that we like stories? And a lot of people will say because of escapism. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of stress and like crap going on in the world that
Yeah.
like, and it's nice to be able to just not think about that and like especially with these mirror neurons where
Mm-hmm.
you're fully sort of dissociating into this other world with other characters. But why is it, if that is the truth, why is it that we crave stories specifically with conflict? Like we've got, I mean, genres that are really big are like action,
Mm-hmm.
horror, true crime,
Yeah.
and that isn't even really escapism in a lot of ways. Like that's
Right.
telling stories about our world and things that have happened. And yet it's a huge, like very popular genre.
Yeah. Well, I think that escapism is a really big factor, and it's the primary reason that a lot of people do engage with stories. It's just not the only one. And you get different things from different kinds of stories. But you can also get escapism from darker things too. It's
Yeah.
just a different brand. But I would say that, like, the easier, lighter hearted, like just for fun, fluffy kinds of like purely escapist stories are also really popular.
Oh,
Like that's why
absolutely.
like rom-coms are so
Studio
big.
Ghibli.
Like cozy
Yep.
fantasy, cottagecore stories,
Yep.
like comfort things like that. Those are really, really popular stories, and they're mostly escapism. They do still follow the arc because it has to follow that arc to be a story. If it doesn't, there's no shape,
Yeah.
If it's purely like good things happening all the time, I mean, like, technically, you can write a story arc where only good things happen all the time, but there is always going to be some sort of conflict there. Because if there's not, it's just a straight line, and there's no
It's not
shape.
compelling to
It's not
us.
compelling to us. There's no reason. If nothing is happening to challenge the characters, there's no reason to keep going because it's just going to keep going like this forever. Like there's no shape to it
Right.
to give meaning to that experience. And that is like integral to what storytelling is like having that forward momentum, the drive to keep going, to get to the end, to see what happens. That seeing what happens is how is the conflict going to resolve? If there's no conflict, there's no seeing what happens. If like Frodo and Sam could just hit the ring with a hammer, there's no reason. And that's why like sometimes you will see that kind of story in like fan fiction, for example, where
Mm.
there's not very much happening because that's like purely escapist. But
And
there's
people want to
usually
experience that world in like a
mhm.
different like setting in some
Right, and
way.
sometimes people want the, like, lower stakes,
Right.
like, you can have desires for, like, the high stakes action or horror, or you can have the desire for the low stakes cozy fantasy or
Yep.
romance, you
It's
know?
it's why I enjoy Baldur's Gate and Animal Crossing.
Exactly. And, like, Animal Crossing is a good example because, like, Animal Crossing has very little narrative structure.
Right.
In the main game, there is some. The conflict is you have to pay off your house, Like, that's the conflict. Eventually, you resolve it. You get the denouement. And then the denouement goes on forever. And you can just keep playing the game. But at that point, that's not a story anymore.
Right.
That's just playing Animal Crossing. And that's really fun. And that still works as escapism, but it doesn't compel you to go to the end to find out what
Right. Well, and I
happens.
have found too that like since paying off my house and unlocking all of the features like being able to do construction on my island and like change things, like I play less
Right.
because I don't feel like there's anything left to complete.
Yeah, there's nothing left to like discover and find out
Right.
anymore. And
Right.
that is like that's part of what makes a story a story. That's the thing that makes a
Yeah.
story a
Well, I
story.
think it's interesting that even though honestly like I do find that still like fun and satisfying to go
Yeah.
in and like redecorate my house or whatever, like, it's not as compelling anymore, and I do wonder if that is part of the way that humans developed story needed to have conflict because otherwise we wouldn't learn as much from it. Like, I think
Yeah.
that there and because some of the people that I've spoken to, especially about their fascination with true crime, there is an element of, well, I wanna know what happened to other people because it makes me feel a little bit more in control that I know what could happen and there are I mean, not in like a victim blamey way in any
Yeah.
way, but like that there are steps to that you can take to potentially prevent some of these horrible things from happening to you
Yeah.
or at least to be able to like more easily recognize red flags.
Yeah. I definitely think that it is very human to look out the window and see the absolute, like, messy chaos of the world and, like, need to find ways to, like, organize that chaos, and one of the ways that we do that is by organizing things into a
Into a
narrative,
narrative, yeah.
and, like, we find comfort in that even if the narrative is bleak or dark or scary, because, like, it gives us back a sense of control that like
Mhm.
we all just sort of inherently crave. Um, you know, because we're not the polar bear just mutating our way through life. Well, we have to like look at the world and understand it in a way that like other species don't,
Yeah.
and that is terrifying and sad a lot of the
Yeah.
time. So
Yeah.
I think that, true crime gives that to people and horror gives that to people. It's like a sense of like, okay, well like even if a horror story like ends badly and doesn't have a happy ending or something, being able to experience those feelings of being in that horrific situation and, like, having it come to a conclusion, it's still taking the, like, random scary chaos of the world and organizing it into something more controlled, and then it also allows you to have, like, the thrill of experiencing
Right.
those feelings in a
While
safe way.
right. So you can be in I mean, even if you're in a movie theater and you're watching a horror movie and the whole theater gets jumped by the jump scare, you're experiencing that momentary,
Mhm.
adrenaline rush, but ultimately, like, you're safe.
Right. Like, you can be in the theater watching it and be, losing your mind in terror over this creepy clown, but also like while all of those like chemicals are roiling through your body and you're getting that experience, you can also just like hide your face in your partner's shoulder and not have to see it and know you're like comforted,
Right, right.
because you
You
are
have the control to close your eyes in
right.
that situation and
Exactly.
not have to experience it.
Right. Whereas like, if it was actually happening, you'd be screwed. You'd better keep your
Yeah.
eyes on that scary cloud.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that like I think that like there's no one super simple answer to these questions. They're like people get a lot of different things out of a
Yeah.
lot of different kinds of stories, and some people will get some things out of them that other people don't, and some people have a higher tolerance. There are some people out there who like extreme horror is a rising genre that's just like it's very dark, it's very scary, it's very violent, and like people are into it. People are loving it. They're eating it up and it's like doing so much for them. And like maybe some of those people could never like stomach the low stakes of like a super chill fantasy novel, and there are people who like can do or like the fantasy or romance, but like can't do
That's
the extreme
me.
horror, which is like, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, like a lot of people will fall somewhere in the middle. But
Yeah.
like, I mean, I think it's very telling that especially since COVID, when like
Mm,
people have particularly wanted the escapism,
yeah.
the two biggest like genres since 2020 have been without a doubt romance and thrillers.
That's so interesting because romance is very predictable.
Technically, so are thrillers.
I mean, yes, yes. And I do wonder if maybe that's part of the enjoyment of them is you
Hmm.
kind of know what's going to happen.
Yep.
So it's familiar. Like I found actually during certain times during COVID, I couldn't take in new media.
Yeah.
It was like everything is so chaotic and so stressful, and I'm feeling like I have no control over the terrible things that are happening in the world
Hmm.
that I'm aware of, that I don't have any tolerance, or my tolerance is significantly lowered for like new
Yeah.
stimulus. Um, so it was a lot of like rewatching my comfort shows.
Hmm.
And if I did pick up a book, it was one I'd already read before
Yeah.
because it was like my nervous system couldn't take the unpredictability because everything was so unpredictable at that time.
Yeah. I have a friend who, like, if you want to get her
You have other
into
friends.
I know, right? Yeah, I have a friend who, like, if you want to get her into a new book or a movie or a show or something, like, the easiest way to do it is to give her, like, a full rundown of the entire plot. Because, like, she will, like, have anxiety about starting a new
So she
thing.
needs the
She
spoilers.
needs the spoilers. She wants the spoilers. She wants to know everything. And then if it sounds compelling enough once she knows the entire story, she'll go in and do it. But like she gets too much anxiety about like not knowing where it's going to go that she just won't start it if she doesn't
So
already know.
interesting.
Yeah. And I mean like I guess we don't all do this, but a lot of people will reread their favorite books
Yeah.
or watch their favorite movies again because like it is comforting to retread that arc. We still get the satisfaction of experiencing the arc, but we don't have to worry about like how is it going to resolve. It's
Yeah.
comforting.
Yeah. It's so interesting too, because you and I both do this where we have certain books or TV shows that we will
Hmm.
watch during certain times of the
Yeah.
year, and that like certain like memories or settings that we are reading or taking in that story during sort of end up infusing the story.
Yeah.
And that is like kind of a cool thing that happens, but it's also like when we had to put our cat down earlier this year, I was very conscious of the media I took in afterwards because
Hmm.
I didn't want to watch or read those stories later on and have them be so attached to those like devastating feelings I was
Yes.
having. So I think that that's also something that is like so, I mean, obviously all of this is so uniquely human
Hmm.
as far as we know.
Right. I suppose dolphins and octopuses could be telling each other stories under the water and we would have no idea.
Potentially, or maybe there really are aliens out there who have a similar
Yeah.
mental capacity.
Also possible.
Um, but then like not only do we tell stories, but when we retell stories, they like absorb the setting that we experience the story in.
Mm-hmm.
Just so
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah, it is weird. Very interesting
It
though.
is. It is. So what does this have to do with genealogy? And and how this one's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
How do the stories we tell ourselves about our own life or our ancestors' lives shape the way we live? So I'll kind of give a little example here. Like
Mm-hmm.
I also mentioned this last episode that like I was never really into history in school because it was a lot of just like here's some white dudes who did some stuff,
Yeah.
memorize their names and the dates that these battles happened, and it was just like without the narrative and like the compelling humanity of those stories, I didn't care. And that is, I think, kind of how I felt about my ancestors until I started really learning things that they went through. Like finding out that my Swedish third third great grandfather, no, second great grandfather, emigrated from Sweden when he was 35 and he didn't marry until he was 35. So like these details are like the hard facts that we have, but we can put that within a story. It is likely that he didn't have the money to provide for
Mm.
a family. And it wasn't until he immigrated and found opportunities in the US that he was able to do that. And he's on several Swedish census records as a farm laborer.
Mm.
But it was very unusual to not be married
Yeah.
at 35. I actually spent a good amount of time following like pre his immigration to see if he had a first wife because that wouldn't have been uncommon
Yeah.
for that time period. Um but like that is compelling. Me telling you like Franz Hermann Johansson Dahlquist came to the US in about 1895.
Yeah. You're just like, all right.
But being able to read into it some and understand the context of different social movements that were happening, different, political conflicts that were happening, it it brings those people to life and it like I feel like it alters the way we see ourselves
Hmm.
in that way.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think maybe this is just because I'm like a fiction writer, but my immediate thought is like almost like how the opposite can impact us too,
Mm.
of like if we don't know the truth, like what do we tell ourselves and how does that impact us too? Like
Yeah.
it makes me think of that like that phrase that like was really popular a couple years ago, the like we're the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn.
Yeah.
And it's always because it's always kind of like it's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way in a way where it's just like I get what you're going for, but like if you really think about it, you're the granddaughters of the people who were burning the witches.
Right.
If you really
Yes.
think about it. And like, but that's not what people want to believe. And
No.
that's not how people want to see themselves. So they like tell themselves this other story
Right.
that's like nicer. Um and that like they can get something out of for themselves. So I think that like we're going to tell ourselves those stories anyway
Yeah.
about where we came from
Yeah.
and like what that means. And genealogy has the ability to like get to the truth and like the reality of
In a
those
way that's maybe
situations, and
uncomfortable.
it can be uncomfortable for sure. Like I know my ancestors were absolutely burning the witches, like the as you
Those
are very
New
well
England
aware. Yeah,
Puritans.
my ancestors were like Massachusetts Puritans who came here in the 1600s. Like
Well, some of them were. And then some of them were Scottish
Scottish.
who came over a little bit later and
Yeah,
settled in like Quebec.
right.
And then all intermarried.
Yeah.
Because there just weren't enough people in that rural area, apparently.
Apparently. But yeah, on my dad's side, definitely some witch burning
Oh,
going
yeah.
on for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, like, it's unpleasant, like, and it is uncomfortable, but I think that, like, maybe because of that, like, ability to, like what we were getting at earlier, when you're experiencing a story, a part of you is experiencing it as though you're going
Right.
through it.
That those mirror
So
neurons.
you can learn from, if you know the stories of your ancestors, you can learn from them, even if it's telling you things about where you came from that you don't necessarily want to know,
Yeah.
you can still learn from that information the same way that kids learned back in the day from Brothers Grimm fairy tales not to talk to strangers or whatever.
Or go into the woods alone.
Right.
So it probably wasn't going to be a witch in a gingerbread house. It was probably going to be like a pack of wolves.
Right. Like, you're gonna get eaten either way. Just don't go in there.
Not ideal. Yeah.
Like,
But it was those stories that taught children those lessons in a
exactly.
way that just telling them, hey, don't do this thing wouldn't.
Right. Like, they're not gonna think about, or if they think about, their mom saying, "Don't go in the woods alone," they might just as easily be like, "Well, screw my mom. I'm gonna do what I want." But
Right.
if you tell a scary story about kids going into the woods alone and getting eaten by a witch, you might think twice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in
And,
the same way that like you can't not think of a pink elephant, telling a child to not do something
mm,
isn't necessarily helpful.
right. It's just gonna make them wanna do it,
Right.
especially if they never had that thought in the first place.
Exactly, exactly. Now you've given them the idea. But if there's a creepy witch who's going to put them in her oven,
Mhm.
that is
That's incentive.
far more compelling.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. So I
Yeah.
think that genealogy has, like, a similar ability because, not all of us, obviously, but a lot of us in the world, our ancestors were living a long time ago and they didn't, like, well, I'm not gonna say they didn't know better because they certainly did. They just, were, you know, bad people living in a time when
Yeah.
that was, like,
A little more enabled.
yeah, exactly. Um, but we can still learn from those realities and those truths and, make the determination to do better than them, even if we do have, an ancestral history that is more in line with that. But I
Yeah.
think, that's also like that's, my perspective as a white New Englander.
Right.
But like it's
But that's
gonna
all
be
you have. Like
like
you don't
that's all I
have the
have.
perspective of
Right. But it's going to be different for other people.
yeah.
And like I think that in the same way you can you can always learn from other people's stories. And I think that like there's a lot to be said for learning about your place in the world that we have it and the accountability that you have because of where you came from,
Right.
that is just like any other lesson, easier to learn through that narrative structure
Yeah.
as opposed to just being like told or even just reading on your own, like, oh well, like my ancestors were these people, what does that mean, like what kinds of lives did they live, where did they come from, why did they do the things they did and make the choices that they made,
Yeah.
those things will stick with you and impact you in a way that just knowing, like, my great 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 grandfather came over in 1623 or whatever,
Right. Right. I think too that knowing about some of our less savory ancestors also, I have found at least, makes me evaluate deeper my own actions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we live in Maine.
Yeah.
There are mostly white people in Maine.
Yeah.
So I, growing up, didn't have a whole lot of firsthand experience with like racism.
Right.
But when I mean, I was examining it somewhat before this because you get to an age where if you're socially conscious at all, you start to examine that, even
Right.
if you're not confronted with it consistently in your life.
Yeah.
But when I found out that one of my ancestors was involved in the slave trade,
Mm.
it made me evaluate even more. It wasn't just, oh, well, yeah, white people owned slaves, but like, I didn't. To
Right.
find out that like I have a direct ancestor who was involved in that and did perpetuate that harm made me evaluate and reflect on the racism we see today in a different way, because it meant that like my lineage was partially directly responsible
Yeah.
for the harm that was caused. And that doesn't, I spent a little bit of time being like, oh my gosh, like I need to be contributing directly to reparations projects.
Yeah.
And I am still interested in doing that. I'm very poor at the moment.
Well, yeah.
So it's not necessarily super feasible, but I think also talking about it can be helpful for people to acknowledge the fact that like even if you are, and we're going kind of down a rabbit hole right now, but like even if you are a white person who maybe wasn't directly involved or had
Yeah.
ancestors directly involved in the transatlantic slave trade, like your ancestors benefited from
Yeah.
it,
Absolutely.
and you are still benefiting from it
Right.
as a white person.
Yeah.
So I think that understanding that and being able to sit with the discomfort of having problematic ancestors is an important part of like processing those stories.
Yeah.
And even if it's not, even if there isn't like an obvious next step or solution to that, being able to like sit with it and acknowledge it and be uncomfortable and recognize that it is
Mhm.
uncomfortable, I think is like a really important step in processing those stories.
Yeah, well, you can't do anything about the problem if you're not aware of the
Right.
problem and you're not aware of your own place within that structure. I mean, it's like such an old structure at this point.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you need to have that kind of like narrative in your head of like how these like issues have developed over time and the place that your ancestors had in that, and therefore the place, like you said, like because of that, like I can be like, oh well, my ancestors were shitty people, but that doesn't change the fact that like I benefit from the systems that they
Yes.
helped to build and uphold over all of that time.
Right.
Like I do.
Right.
And like if you
There
it's
isn't,
easier to like deny that and ignore that and not recognize your place
because it's
if you
uncomfortable.
because it's uncomfortable and like no one wants to do that, but like you have a responsibility to do that, and it like if you're aware of that context you can't ignore it in the same
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
If
And
you just to completely divorce yourself like, well, that has nothing to do with me, then you're absolving yourself from dealing with it
yeah.
now.
Yeah. And I mean, we're not here to solve racism.
No. But
um
it is something that, like, everyone should be, like, engaging with and thinking about,
yeah,
and it does
absolutely.
permeate, like, everything that we do, so
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there are many systems that we either benefit or are hurt by that were created by some of our
yeah.
ancestors. I mean, and I think that this is also pretty common in a lot of like fiction stories when so like when, I know you don't really watch Star Wars,
No.
but the art, spoilers for Star Wars. The art of like Luke, I am your father.
Yeah.
Like the protagonist finds out that the villain is where he got his Y chromosome. Like
Right.
that is, and like what do you do with that? Like
Mhm.
what do you do if you find out that you like is there a fear of, well, if one of my direct ancestors was like incredibly evil, does that mean that I inherently will become inevitably
Hmm. Like the Aragorn question.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I think that the ultimate answer to that is just that humans have the ability like to display great evil and also like great kindness and generosity and
Right.
like
And we all have choices
yeah,
to make,
yeah,
and
and some of those are like more restricted by circumstance than
of
others.
course.
But ultimately, if you are someone who is thinking that, you're probably not going to become incredibly evil.
Yeah.
And so, but that also means that like you need the context and the story to be able to even process that. To like,
Mm.
you need to be aware of the fact that like this is your history in order to have the thought, well, if I come from people who were bad people, does that mean I will inherit? Like to have that thought,
Mhm.
you need to know the
Right.
story.
Yeah. And it can also make you aware of, like maybe if you might have certain like thoughts or tendencies or feelings, the more you know about like your own personal context, like the more aware of yourself you can be to
Absolutely.
be able to be like, oh, okay, well, like maybe I don't want to act in these ways for these reasons
Yeah.
or whatever. I mean, and that can also like just impact, even like health stuff, like,
Yes. Like it's not just like moral situations that
yeah.
we put ourselves in, but like there are some people who are very aware that like addiction runs in their
Hmm.
family. So they don't drink alcohol
Right.
because they don't want to put themselves in that situation. I mean, that's a very like sort of simplified version of it, but also
Yeah.
knowing that like, well, heart disease runs in my family, so I'm going to make sure that I eat less foods with cholesterol and I try to stay more
Mhm.
active, but like it's knowing that that allows us to live with it,
Yeah.
to like live with it in a way that will maybe be better,
Hmm.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're all aware of the little witch in the woods inside of us.
The one who didn't get burned.
Right. Now she's just lurking around eating children.
Oh no. Any last thoughts?
Uh, Stories are cool.
Yeah, they are. They're very fun.
They allow us to expand our experience beyond just our one little life, which allows us to be more open minded, be more empathetic, make more meaning for ourselves in the world, find more enjoyment in the world in our brief time here, and apparently share neurons,
Yeah.
which is very cool.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
Empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Crucial. More and more all the time, it feels like.
Absolutely it is.
Yeah.
And well, I'm glad to have shared your neurons.
Aw.
So, I know that you don't have anything. Well, no, you do have a few like short stories published, right?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So
short
if
stories
people
and
are
stuff.
curious and want to find you, where could they find you online?
Well, I have a website that is my name and it is so long.
I can put it in the show notes. Like,
It's just chelseadgbartlett.com. I got my auto charge for it the other day and I was like, oh yeah, that's the thing that exists.
wonderful. And we will be, I'm sure, expecting sometime in the not too distant future, fingers crossed, for some exciting news
Oh, I hope so. Someday.
today. Well, thank you for chatting with me after our very much needed best friend weekend. And I hope that people enjoyed this episode. I know it was pretty different structurally than the
Yeah.
last few, but I'm playing around a little bit and wanted to take advantage of Kelsey's story knowledge, and some of these thoughts that I've been having about the stories we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
So, um, come back next time to learn about a French pirate.
Who doesn't want to learn about pirates?
Yeah,
I know I do.
yeah. And actually, on that note, if you haven't watched Black Sails, go do it.
Yeah,
It's
go do
on
it.
Netflix right now.
Not only is it a great story, it's a great story about stories and the power of stories about a story. It's so good.
It's very good.
It's the best pirate show.
And it's got pirates.
Yeah, it's about pirates. It's like a prequel to Treasure Island. It's amazing. I can't talk it up enough. It's like one of my favorite shows of all time.
That's fantastic.
And it's on Netflix currently. So.
Yes. So
Plug for
if,
Black Sails.
if you're desperate for pirates before the next episode comes out, go watch Black Sails.
Mhm.
And otherwise, I will see you in 2 weeks. Take care, guys.
Bye.